English translation, 710th Contact, Part 2 Tuesday, the 11th of September 2018, 21:14 hours.
But I would like to say something about what you said earlier about primitive, because I know the meaning of the term primitive, of course, even though I generally use it in everyday life to describe unpleasant, unclean, disorderly, antisocial, criminal, deviant, and unethical people, criminal, degenerate, evil, wrong, negative, bad, unjust, and etc., because this is common in Earth human being usage, and what is meant by it is understood. It is absolutely clear to me that the term denotes something like an original state, something primal. Not civilized, something very simple, plain, simple, as well as primitive human beings and peoples, such as so-called savages, headhunters, and cannibals, who are primitive, elementary, and naive. Among us Earthlings, the term primitive is used in many different ways, as well as for something meager, poor, meager, and makeshift, as well as for a low consciousness, stupidity, and stupidity, a low cultural level, and thus also an uneducatedness, and so on. Of course, I also know that you use other terms for the Earth foreigners, but I am not familiar with these, which is why I use the term most common among the human beings of Earth, namely, primitive.
We call the Earth foreigners spoken of immature, primitive, as well as low-minded, cruel, inhuman, and unapproachable, calling them unfeeling, and, in our judgment, as uncompromising creatures and brutes, because they are of an inhumane disposition and behavior, consequently dominated by contrary impulses with regard to humanity, compassion, empathy, peace and freedom, etc., are dominated by contrary impulses. This is the reason for our strict restraint towards these Earth foreigners, against whom we have always shielded ourselves from sight and from their analytical swinging waves and techniques in such a way that they can neither locate us nor perceive us in any other way, while we, on the contrary, can penetrate their flying apparatuses by vibration and observe and study them very closely. I am therefore also very well informed that they are of an inhumane disposition and incapable of positive action in the sense of fulfilling nature-given creational laws and recommendations or recommendations. The technology necessary for this, which our early ancestors adopted more than 30 million Earth years ago from the Sonarn of the Dal creation area, was thus applied very early for the purpose of complete shielding from all Earth foreigners on Earth, who truly correspond to immature and primordial and whose technology has been stagnating for a long time. So even at the present time, they are not sufficiently developed and not advanced enough for them to be able to locate or otherwise perceive us, even if we were standing right next to them at the shortest distance. It is undeniable that their technology is very advanced, but they are still no match for ours. Consequently, when we openly discuss all these facts since the beginning of our contact and mention our presence here on Earth and sometimes also make ourselves visible to Earth humans with regard to an observation concerning our flying objects, it also follows that these Earth foreigners are not and also will not be able to realize our presence. This is because they cannot fathom our shielding technology and can neither locate nor otherwise perceive us even under the best of circumstances. For in spite of their high technical possibilities, they are helplessly inferior to our still many times higher developments in every relation and respect.
And our Earthling Secret Service, military and other supervisors with their primitive antediluvian techniques, radar apparatuses, the still secret and all other surveillance devices are even more so. But it is interesting what you say regarding Earth foreigners' surveillance technology. But what about when Earth foreigners can observe your beam ships? Isn't there a danger and possibility that these extraterrestrials will also pick up on it?
There is no problem in this respect, for our technology is such that such sightings can only take place if the Earth foreigners or Earth future, as well as the secretive Earth grouping with the progressive flying apparatuses in South America, have no possibility whatsoever of locating or otherwise perceiving our flying apparatuses on a technical basis. Our security technology is configured in such a way that an automatic fuse shields everything and makes it impenetrable to any kind of detection with regard to all possible swinging waves, but also with regard to light waves and energies, etc., which are directed towards our flying apparatus, other of our achievements, or towards us as persons ourselves. This is also the case when visual observation is made possible as a result of a screen opening. For even then, no locating of any kind can take place, either by the Earth foreigners or by any earthly technology. And this is also the case when there is absolute certainty that we are present at a certain place. So all our flying apparatus, as well as all our persons and all our achievements with regard to safety and freedom from localization, are in every respect so perfectly developed that in every situation, everything is always absolutely shielded from counter-vibration. And consequently, no localization or any other kind of perception can take place. And this is because our security system neutralizes any locating vibration of any form within a yottosecond. Consequently, we as a person, our flying apparatuses, achievements, and swinging waves, etc., are absolutely not locatable.
I know this because your daughter Simyase has already explained this to me. It is not even possible to locate your life vibrations when one is standing close to you, because the vibrations are neutralized directly on the body and are therefore not radiated outwards, as is also the case with your beam ships, etc. So you have a neutralization technique in your body. So you have a neutralization technique with regard to locating vibrations, locating rays and locating light of all kinds, as well as with regard to all kinds of special locating energies, etc. Consequently, our earthly radar and other locating methods are no more than primitive kindergarten experiments for you. But that you have just mentioned the earthly grouping in South America, etc., that irritates me a little, because up to now this was not allowed to be mentioned openly.
You can call it that, as you have explained it. But as far as my statement is concerned concerning the grouping keeping itself secret, it is now no longer necessary not to mention this, to which, however, I will give you a personal explanation later, which will be only for you.
Good, then so be it. However, I have also experienced that this is the case, that your technique is absolutely perfect, as for example when you took me to the bear in Graubünden on the 16th of July 2005, the first bear to reappear in Switzerland in about 100 years. At that time, you attached a tiny pin to me, which shielded all my life vibrations, so that I could not be perceived by the bear either, and when I went up to him, he even touched me on my trousers without being able to perceive me. Nevertheless, as I know, it can happen that you let out swinging waves under certain circumstances.
This is indeed the case, but only if there is absolute certainty that neither Earth foreigners nor Earth future are to be located within a certain safety radius. Earthly life forms, on the other hand, do not fall within this security perimeter. Consequently, they can sense certain swinging waves from our flying apparatus if they are not shielded.
I see. That also explains to me some incidents where swinging waves have emanated from your beam ships and unexpected things, happenings and situations have resulted.
I am aware of that also, that unfortunately there have been disadvantages and damage as a result.
Unfortunately, that was indeed the case, but it was the fault of the Earthlings concerned, because they... But now I want to continue with what I was saying. Certain abductions of human beings from Earth for various purposes, and thus of course the corresponding contacts, which have taken place again and again since time immemorial, have always belonged to the behavior of the old Earth foreigners and Earth future, as well as to the newer ones who fly in and out of Earth and back again. But the fact is, in spite of abductions, etc., that none of these Earth foreigners and Earth foreigners have, up to the present time, conveyed any messages and the like to the Earthlings, precisely messages with regard to how they would have fallen, or would fall today, within the framework of the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, and thus within the sphere of the Nocademian and my mission. Likewise, like the Earth foreigners are at times to be observed in earthly space with their futuristic flying apparatuses. Though the Earth foreigners have just as nothing to do with them as you, Plejaren have nothing to do with them, nor with the Earth foreigners. You Plejaren yourselves have always shielded yourselves from the Earth foreigners when you appear on Earth, who have also been working on Earth for a long time. And your shielding from them is such that you cannot be perceived by them in any way, neither visually, nor can you be located or registered by any apparatus. Your general Plejaren technology, so also space technology and space-time bridging technology, etc., have been so highly developed for millions of years, through the help of the Sonair from the Dial universe or the Dial creation, that the Earth foreigners functioning on Earth have never been able to locate, detect or otherwise register any flying apparatus of Plejaren origin, or also only any Plejaren activities since their existence in prehistoric times up to the present time. So the Earth foreigners, who work on Earth and are observed again and again, have nothing to do with you Plejaren, just as you have nothing to do with the Earth foreigners and Earth future, whereby, as explained, you are in no way to be located, otherwise recognizable or registerable for them. Moreover, you did not and do not interfere in any way with any earthly political, military, and economic concerns, but have endeavored over all the past millennia to develop in many ways all fields of knowledge and development by transmitting impulses to certain scientists, inventors, and researchers, etc.
That is correct.
I know. That's why I also wrote the following in an article. About 4 decades ago, towards the end of the 1970s, the Plejaren launched an attempt to make official contact with the government of the USA and to make themselves openly recognizable also to the Earth foreigners, in order to give helpful measures and advice with regard to a world peace. But this was made impossible by megalomaniac requests and demands of those then responsible for the whole of the attempt. And the fact that, according to your Plejaren declarations, the USA was taken into consideration was due to the fact that the communist USSR still existed at that time, and that this form of politics at that time offered no possibility whatsoever to make a peace request to the powerful of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This is because, if I may interpret it accurately today, according to your clarifications and statements, the then chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, Wikipedia, 16th of June 1977 to the 10th of November 1982, would have feared that by making effective efforts in your sense, he would expose himself to the USA and work into their hands in their hegemonic striving with regard to the USSR. Also, the Brezhnev successive chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, Wikipedia, Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, 16th of June 1983 to the 9th of February 1984. Konstantin Yustinovich Chernenko, 11th of April 1984 to the 10th of March 1985, and Andrei Andreevich Gromyko, the 2nd of July 1985 to the 1st of October 1988. You, Plejaren, fathomed at the time, were burnt children with regard to the USA and its policy of hegemony, as a result of which at a later stage they too could not have been considered. It should also be said that the Holocaust was undoubtedly the greatest crime of mass human extermination that has ever taken place on Earth, triggered by the insane psychopath Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist rule he brought about, which was accompanied by the persecution, ghettoization, and in particular the mass extermination of the Jews in Germany and Europe. Never before and also afterwards has there been any other similar mass extermination of human life, but nevertheless, the whole of all the horrors of the Nazi mass extermination of human beings was surpassed by the nuclear unlucky star crime against humanity, by the USA, with the development of nuclear technology, the atomic bomb and its dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All the mischief that has resulted from this, also through the spread of nuclear technology in other states, mostly through espionage, which has created a worldwide danger of nuclear war and nuclear contamination, which continues in this framework to this day and also into the far future, is more than just a crime against humanity, but effectively also irresponsible, conscienceless, amoral, malicious, nefarious, and unscrupulous. And how the deadly and destructive nuclear technology has spread on Earth through espionage, and which states have carried out how many nuclear tests. I found the following information on the internet at Wikipedia. List of nuclear weapons tests, state number of tests. Period von Bees, People's Republic of China, 45, 1964 to 1996. France, 198, 1960 to 1996. United Kingdom, 45, 1952 to 1991. India, 3, 1974 and 1998. Pakistan, 2, 1998. North Korea, 6, 2006 to 2017. Soviet Union, 718, 1949 to 1990. United States, 1039, 1945, 2012. Worldwide, 2056, 1945 to 2017.
I am aware of this data, to which I will say, however, that every single test was a malicious crime and, moreover, the development of nuclear technology by the USA was such an unforgivable crime against humanity without equal that, in my opinion, it cannot be put into words.
Then another thing. In the Talmud, 30th chapter, sentence 96, it is written, "And it came to pass that a soldier took his lance and thrust it into Emmanuel's loins, that he might see that he was dead." Last week, you know who she is, the priestess, telephoned me and asked me if I could answer a question for one of her works, which is disputed in her circles, namely where or on which side the warrior rammed his lance into Emmanuel's body to see whether he was dead or not. The dispute was because it had been handed down that the warrior had wounded Emmanuel on the left. Of course, I told her that Emmanuel had been stabbed on the right side of the loin with the lance, because the left was to be defined from the war servant's point of view. But then I had to explain this to her in detail, because there was also a clerical error made by Judas Iscarioth, who had made the records, because he used the term loin, although it was actually on the right side of the abdomen or belly between the ribcage and pelvis.
Which you have openly and clearly explained correctly. And that this was indeed the case can be proven since then and today, as well as in the future, with all new personalities of the succession lineage of the Nocodemian spirit form, and thus after Emmanuel, thus also with you. This is because through the level of Arahat Atharsata, a mark was determined and set, which is to prove the truth of the successors of Emmanuel until far into the future.
Congenital mark on the right side of Billy's body, as determined by the level of Arahat Atharsata. And this is given because it has been foreseen that many deceivers and delusionists will appear with lies, deceit and fraud and through delusion and sectarianism, and will presume to pass themselves off as direct reincarnations of Christ. And this will happen as was foresightedly recognized, although a rebirth of an earth human being cannot be possible because only his spirit form is classified as reincarnation. Consequently, only a new personality can be born, not reborn, which has an entirely different individuality, a different appearance, a different form, as well as an absolutely different nature and other peculiarities than these factors were inherent in the old and deceased personality. This is also rightly taught by you through the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. And now, as to the mark formed by the plane Arahat Atharsata, and ordained that all later personalities of the Nocodemian spirit form, after the occurrence of the lance stitch in Emmanuel, should bear a faint but visible mark on the right side of the trunk between the diaphragm and pelvis respectively. This is to serve as a mark of recognition of the correctness of a successor personality of Emmanuel. Through the presence of this weak scar mark, Earth humans who prove themselves to be endeavoring and learning with regard to the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life and thus as observant reasoners, shall be able to demonstrably recognize the successor personalities of Emmanuel, and thus also the spirit form lineage of Nocodemion, if they should necessarily be urged to do so by the sense.
Did you have to do that now? I would like to leave that out when I recall and transcribe the conversation. What you just explained I do not think is good, because I do not want to become a show object.
You should not, and you will also not become a show object, as you say. But the whole thing shall become public to expose the sectarian delusionists and the liars and deceivers who pretend to be born again Emmanuel alias Christ. These elements are to be exposed and convicted of their lies and frauds, as was the case with all those who acted in the same way, who, lying and deceiving, claimed for themselves personal contacts with us Plejaren, or feigned such contacts through alleged channeling, and some of whom are still doing so today. But thou thyself shalt be harmless in this, and it shall not be a burden to thee. Consequently, thou shalt not be concerned about it.
You say so, but I can try not to care about it. For if you see it so and want it, as you declare, then so be it. It is true that the mark is not in such a way that it is particularly conspicuous and strongly marked. But it is only faint in approach, but still recognizable, even if it does not look like a scar, but only as a faint mark, as you call it. So it is not conspicuous, but nevertheless it has been seen, and I have been asked about it 2 or 3 times, to which, however, I have only given a trivial answer each time.
You can do that, however, if only trivial questions are asked about it.
It may be that the whole thing is necessary in the way you mention, for when I think of what happened again recently when a cult follower turned up at my house, a member of what is supposed to be a reincarnated Jesus Christ alias Christ Sanandaj, that is to say Jesus Sananda Emmanuel, spreading messages. She fanatically raked me over the Jesus Sananda Emmanuel nonsense and wanted to get me on her cult side, which is why I think it may well be necessary for something to be done in the way you say. The woman brought me 2 more books entitled, And They Called Him Emmanuel, I Am Sananda, and Space Gate, The Veil is Removed, Nos. 2 and 3 from the Phoenix Journal. In one of the books it is mentioned that in Chapter 5 of a Phoenix Journal, it is written by this Christ Sananda what an imaginary player and commander named Giorgos Queris Haton is supposed to say in the so-called Phoenix Journals, and I will read some of that to you here.
A brief summary of what the Phoenix Journals are has been given by Commander Haton himself. These journals are the words of truth, which are God's promise for publication in the end times, to give humanity one last chance to choose truth over lies. I also enjoyed very much the verification of the Swiss Billy Meyer, who after his breathtaking long-time experiences and co-flights in spaceships founded the Sim-Yase Silver Star Center in Switzerland and wrote down his experiences in the book The Truth About the Pleiades, a real revelation. Promptly, Billy's life was made very, very unpleasant by the anti-Christian power elites or their henchmen. In said book there are also photographs of the beam ships in flight, and to my great delight Haton tells us that he himself was present in one of them at the time. Giorgos Queris Haton later outed himself as none other than our Creator's Son Christ Michael Aton, and is thus the highest authority among the authors. I did not come then to bring peace to the world, but the sword of truth and knowledge, and the power of the Spirit inherent in human beings. The actual authors are portrayed as entities from the so-called Brotherhood of Light of the cosmic planes, foremost among them a Giorgos Queris Haton, Supreme Commander for Project Earth Transition, Esu Jesus Emmanuel Sananda, who was already incarnated 2,000 years ago as a messenger of the spiritual planes on this planet, commonly known as Jesus Christ, and various masters of the color rays, such as, for example, the probably best-known master of the violet ray Saint-Germain, who has also guided the destiny of the world several times in physical garb. Haton introduces himself with these words, I am Giorgos Queris Haton, Supreme Commander Project Earth Transition, Pleiades Sector Flight Command, Intergalactic Fleet Federation under the command of Ashtar, Earth Representative to the Cosmic Council and Intergalactic Federation Council on Earth Transition. You may call me Haton.
I am also quoted in the book Space Gate as follows.
Straightening out some records, I will take this opportunity to give credit and correct a few errors. The contacts of Pleiadian ships and commanders with Billy Edward Meyer in Switzerland are genuine, and you there had better start paying attention to them. Earth humans have a miserable nature and destroy everything they do not understand. So, you are to be put down by our people who are with you, to bring you the truth and a certain degree of knowledge. Billy Meyer has nothing to gain and absolutely everything to lose by bringing our contacts and teachings to the public. My Pleiadian commanders came to you politely and willingly to support you, and you bully them and devalue them. I, Commander Haton of the Pleiades Billy Meyer, will be honored. My promise to beloved Billy Edward Meyer is great. That, just as in the case of Judas Iscariot, your name will be cleared and will go down in all honor in the books of transition. So be it. The returning Emmanuel, now known in his fulfilled inheritance as Sananda, travels with myself, Aton from the light.
This sect is known to me, but not their books and journals, etc., which is why I am unfamiliar with what has been read aloud, which I find extremely stupid and full of lies and deceit.
For me, it is absolutely clear that this Jesus Sananda Emmanuel sect, that is to say the originator of the whole thing, has stolen my materials of the teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life, and transformed them according to his own sense, and is now spreading everything under the direction of the present sect leadership, as already Glanzmann did and has since then spread everything around the world as his teaching. In addition, the authorship is not exactly well educated in the art of writing, just as it is not exactly a bright light of intelligenity with its interwoven pathologically stupid sectarian phantasmagoria, for very much is so deviant that it effectively appears underdeveloped in terms of consciousness and thus primitive. Everything has clearly been copied, stolen and falsified not only from the teachings, but also from the contact reports, as a result of unreason and lack of understanding, and this obviously already in the 1970s or 1980s as well as in the 1990s, because this sect has been functioning since then, as it still does today with the Pleiades, which we then called the alleged origin of the Plei-Yahran, in order to mislead deceivers, liars, and charlatans, and to be able to expose them as delusional, liars, and deceivers, which then also worked. But this is exactly what this sect did not understand, neither then nor now, which is why it is still muddling around with the Pleiades, and thus leads itself ad absurdum, and reveals itself as a lying and deceiving sect. In all this, God is also used to a great extent, so it is clear from everything that a religious sectarianism is in the foreground.
We have talked about this before when it was mentioned once.
I know, but we didn't talk about it openly then. Consequently, the conversation was also not retrieved and not written down.
But now it is supposed to be that you retrieve everything and put it all in writing, for which I have my reasons.
Then so be it.
Yes.
That's good, so be it. But now I will bring up something from your history that your father Shvath has already told me about. Namely, that you Plei-Yahran on Era and on other planets have been at peace among all peoples for about 52,000 years only because something strange has happened. At that time, I remember Shvath's explanation. A round structure or a large metallic sphere appeared above Era and other Plei-Yahran planets, after which all male and female inhabitants of all planets, so to speak, experienced a comprehensive change of heart. Neither at that time nor to this day, however, could you Plei-Yahran fathom what this sphere was about, nor where it had come from and where it had disappeared to. Only one thing was clear, namely that through this sphere some process of consciousness took place in all human beings of all Plei-Yahran planets, which immediately led to an all-embracing peace, as well as to freedom from strife, war, crime, and so on. And as Shvath explained, as you also once did years ago, you never found out where this orb came from, who built it, and where it disappeared to. Consequently, it was only clear to you that it was through this that your peoples came to peace, and all that has distinguished you Plei-Yahran as true human beings for 52,000 years.
What had to be explained in this respect, you have now done, but I must mention that up to now, despite a great deal of research, we have not been able to gain any knowledge about the origin of the sphere, which was completely untouchable and secured against all attacks, and therefore also indestructible, because it resisted all attempts at attack, which was a good thing in the end. This large spherical missile, which according to our annals had a size that I have calculated to be 248 meters according to the earthly system of measurements, circled around each Playaran planet for 32 days and nights, and then disappeared without a trace. Since then, all the corresponding efforts to clarify the matter, which still continue today, have not been successful, which is why we also have no knowledge of what kind of technology the flying objects had, through which all our peoples were pacified.
To know that would really be not only interesting but also very useful, because through such a technique, whole humanities could be turned into peaceful life forms, which I would also wish for the humanity of Earth. Perhaps we could talk to each other about what possibilities you are considering in your research. Because I think that there are probably many, because your technology, which today is largely based on the technical achievements of the sonar, certainly offers an enormous number of options. Therefore, it may sound presumptuous if I, in my simplicity, dare to say that under certain circumstances an idea eventuality from my consciousness could be a means and a way to get to the bottom of the matter with research in the form of an alternative solution or alternative possibility.
I do not want to doubt it, but with our possibilities, certain successes can probably be expected at some point, even if it can still take a very long time.
Nothing ventured, nothing gained, which is why I think at least a try couldn't hurt.
I do not want to doubt that either, which is why I think we should talk about it.
Good, let us do it privately then. But now I want to talk about the predictions from the 1940s, 1950s, and also the later years that have been coming true continuously for years. Like in terms of climate change, the tremendous fires in the US, and the increasing number of landslides that are tremendously increasing due to the dissolution of the permafrost. But I have a question about what your automatic forecasting apparatus sees in this regard or otherwise for the near future.
A particularly tragic event will take place in the near future, but also all the other predictions mentioned in all your manifestos, as well as those of Hylock and my father Svath, concerning the natural events caused by Earthman guilt and destroying everything will infallibly come true, whereby these coming events will claim many human lives and destruction. For your protection in the center, Quetzal has already given you some instructions to carry out certain works that can prevent much damage in the center's area, following which you have ordered various works that have been carried out satisfactorily under your direct instruction and control, and thanks to your extensive expertise. As usual, your wide-ranging education and skill in various fields of work also pays off in terms of what is now to be done in the correct manner with regard to various fields of work in order to ensure the best possible safety and to avoid great damage. It is true that some things will seem somewhat strange to various persons when you give certain instructions and work has to be done, which will cause them some surprise. But everything is to be done as you instruct it. For the whole of the work to be done is the result of foresight and therefore, for reasons of safety, necessitates that it be done in order to avoid much harm, which would otherwise result in the future. A lot will have to be done according to the vegetation in the area you call Bungert, as well as with regard to the tree growth around the house and the garden, which you have already partly taken up and carried out with Michael. Also with regard to the connection between the poultry grounds, for which your professional planning will be required. There is a lot of professional work to be done. But I recommend that this be done by professionals, as you also considered this when we talked about it recently, because you can no longer carry out this project yourself due to your serious injury. However, what I said earlier in relation to coming events, I now want to elaborate on a little. But what has been said will happen in 17 days. On the 28th of September, as our automatic forecasts record and make clear, because near Sulawesi in Indonesia, there will be a severe seaquake, measuring 7.6 on the Richter scale, which will trigger a great tsunami, as well as spread death and destruction, to which many human lives will fall victim, the number of which will be high and over many thousands. Also, more quakes will follow, as well as the local volcano will stir and thus increase the terror in the population, which will also be on the 9th of October when another seaquake of magnitude 5.4 will occur, but will not be the last. Another major sea quake of magnitude 6 will occur on the 6th of October in Haiti, in a zone where quakes will occur again and again. But the new sea quake will cause little damage in relation to the magnitude of the quake and will cause few deaths and injuries. Then, on the 9th of October, a primeval rainstorm will hit the Mediterranean island of Majorca, claiming several human lives and causing a great deal of damage, especially through enormous masses of water, and a great storm with much disaster is also to be expected in Greece and Sardinia. Later, a hurricane with a storm speed of about 180 kilometers per hour will hit the west coast of Europe from the Atlantic and bring severe storms from the south to the north, which will cause much damage and destruction and will also claim lives. At the same time as a flash flood storm is raging in Majorca, an extremely dangerous hurricane is heading for Florida, bringing much disaster, great destruction, and storm surges. But other events have already been recorded for the next 41 days, such as a 6.1 magnitude sea quake on the 10th of October in the Java Sea off the coast of the Indonesian islands of Java and Bali, which will be followed on the 11th of October by a 7.2 magnitude sea quake near the Pacific island nation of Papua New Guinea. Although these are also significant, but I do not want to talk about them today along with other upcoming events, so I will not mention the important facts. Various other events will also take place in the near future. But I do not want to talk about them in detail now, but only mention the following, which is not official, but only for your personal information.
Thanks. What you said is enough for me. These events are caused by geotectonics, on which human beings have no direct influence, in contrast to what is caused by human beings as a result of overpopulation and their unconscionable environmentally destructive machinations on nature, fauna, flora, as well as on the oceans, inland waters, forests, floodplains, meadows and landscapes, etc. Again and again. Climate researchers, politicians and environmentalists get together, babble senseless stuff and think they are very clever with their opinions, which lack intelligence, and their babbling nonsense about reducing CO2 emissions, plastic consumption and the spread of dirt and toxins in nature and in the atmosphere, etc. In this regard, senseless reduction decisions are set for years to come, in order to reduce the total dirty emissions over the course of so and so many years. But all these experts are so intelligently deluded that they can neither perceive nor comprehend the effective reality and its truth. So they do not see and do not recognize the fact that at present 100 to 110 million human beings are born every year, which, however, is denied by crazy statistics and stated to be much less. Consequently, the total number of Earth humans is also stated to be more than 1 billion less than it actually is. At present, the Earth's population is stated to be around 7.6 billion, whereas according to extremely accurate Play-Aran counts, on the 31st of December 2017, Earth humans already numbered 8,844,128,000 and 2 equal sign, or 8.844 billion. The fact that extremely inaccurate calculations of possibilities result in completely wrong numbers and thus around 1.2 billion more human beings populate the Earth than the wrong statistics indicate, is not something that wants to enter the skulls of all the academic know-it-alls, etc., who, according to their academic education, as this states, is only based on assumptions and conjectures. The term academic derives from the name of the ancient Greek hero Akademos, and usually denotes teaching and research activities at universities, as well as rarely any activities at academies. Basically, however, an academic question refers to any problem based on assumptions and conjectures, the solution of which has little or no practical relevance and is actually useless, except that holders of academic titles can boast about them. On the one hand, this means that it can be calculated that when, for example, a 10-year plan and a resolution for the reduction of pollutants is passed, whereby such resolutions are only half-bakedly passed and implemented or even ratified by experts anyway, whereby they still get paid horrendously for it at corresponding conferences, etc., eat royally and have expensive drinks poured down their throats. On the other hand, Only nonsense is talked about, and the real consequences and situations that arise in the future are not considered. And on the one hand, this also happens with regard to the actual increase in the Earth's population, which is many millions more than is falsely claimed by statistics, whereby these new millions of human beings naturally need food, nappies, means of transport, prams, car seats, carriers, etc., hygiene articles, medicines, shoes, clothing, and much more, as they have always done from birth. And on the other hand, what all these offspring need as growing children and adolescents as well as adults, and in multiples of what they needed earlier as babies, is also not included in the statistical calculations of the experts or know-it-alls. So the world population is growing inexorably, with more human beings being born than dying. On the other hand, many millions of young human beings enter adulthood every year, which means that they claim their adult rights as responsible citizens, and as a result, the first step in coming of age is usually the acquisition of a vehicle, a car, or a large motorbike. On the one hand, this means that the existing roads, which are already overcrowded with vehicles, will become even more congested, and new ones will have to be built constantly. On the other hand, however, CO2 emissions will also increase again by a factor of millions, which will inevitably lead to the ill-considered and nonsensical decisions and plans of the experts and know-it-alls being overturned. In reality, however, it is the case that when such nonsensical decisions are made, they are already nullified minutes later, because during this time human beings are already making thousands, and in the coming time millions of new procreations, which increase in a single year to 100 to 110 million fertilizations and procreations, and accordingly lead to births. And what all these many human beings need from birth to death in the way of food and all kinds of necessities of life, and what they desire in the way of luxury goods, results in levels of consumption that require that, on the one hand, as a result of an abysmal desire for profit, and, on the other hand, for the highest possible utilization and exploitation of nature. Fauna and flora, fields, meadows, moors, the seas and inland waters as well as the forests and meadows are poisoned with pesticides, herbicides and fungicides, and the earth itself is robbed of its resources through conscienceless and criminal machinations. Hence the statement that the earth, its nature, fauna and flora, the seas and inland waters are being plundered and destroyed by the evil machinations of overpopulation, up to and including the complete destruction and extermination of birds, useful insects, animals, creatures, fish, lizards, snakes, etc., etc. And hardly anyone cares that the human unscrupulous machinations with regard to the worldwide impairments, destructions, annihilations and extinctions of nature, fauna, flora, and the earth, which have long since become general, are also eradicating the foundations of life and existence for earthly mankind. Just as they do not care that in Europe certain life forms have already disappeared and been wiped out in nature by up to 60% and more. So it is that only individual human beings are concerned about the whole thing, although effectively an extinction and disappearance of innumerable genera and species of plants, fish and other aquatic life, animals, creatures and insects, etc. from their habitats, which are important for the survival of human beings, is taking place.
You are stating facts about which Earth humans would have to give a lot of thought, then make correct and logical resolutions, and put them into action. However, what is already destroyed and annihilated cannot be made good, which is why all efforts must only be directed towards still doing the best possible to avoid further destructive and annihilating machinations, which would still aggravate the already pre-programmed, which will inevitably come true. Only by doing this will it be possible to prevent further additional destruction, annihilation and extinction in nature, fauna and flora, as well as in the climate and the planet itself, which will exceed the already largely pre-programmed measure of what can no longer be prevented and which will be catastrophic. And this alone is the way and also the possibility that with it the Earth, its atmosphere and climate, as well as nature and its fauna and flora, as well as all waters and seas, can slowly be granted a recovery in the course of the following times, which, however, will correspond to a process lasting centuries and millennia. Only in this way can what is necessary be done for the distant descendants of Earth humans and be given a chance to survive. And also only if a drastic reduction of overpopulation is enforced by a birth stop of several years, and then permanent state-controlled birth control.
That is in line with what I am also thinking. But now I want to go back a little and tell you what I have seen and experienced through journeys with Svath into the future. Namely, future things that will become extremely unpleasant for Earth humans if they do not make a decisive and rapid change for the better, the good, and the correct. The future journeys with Svath have two different forms in relation to what can result for humanity on Earth, whereby today I want to speak of and clarify those facts which will result in the negative case if reason and rationality do not finally triumph as the most important factor for the change of mind for the good and correctness of the general and particular conduct of life. I will therefore explain how things will turn out if nothing is done in general in all countries for correct and good governance, and if separatism continues to be practiced in various countries, as for example in Catalonia for a long time and also at present. This also includes the hegemonic behavior of the USA, which is aimed at world domination, and which should finally come to an end, whereby the entire U.S. armed forces should also be withdrawn from foreign states, and the USA should also end all its influence on foreign countries. If peace, freedom, and tranquility are to come to Earth humans, then means must be taken very quickly by which all technical, electronic, economic, political, and social developments no longer continue to develop negatively as they have up to now. Particularly with regard to the production and sale of arms to all corners of the world. It must be said that this is a factor which, if nothing worthwhile is done about it and this evil is not completely dissolved, the whole thing will continue to lead to discord, lack of freedom, and time and again to acts of war and terrorism. The production of arms and the transfer of arms all over the world is the most decisive factor which cannot lead to lasting peace and effective freedom and democracy. Apart from this fact, things will also occur in nature which have been provoked by mankind itself, and so, for example, the landslides will increase, as I have already tried to do in the 1940s and 1950s with predictions to rouse mankind by appropriate warnings to many public media and to governments, etc., which are steadily increasing due to the dissolution of the permafrost. All other predictions are also proving correct in the future, for all natural disasters are becoming more and more violent, such as the ever more primeval storms of all kinds, the earthquakes, seaquakes, tsunamis, and ever more severe floods and droughts, etc. As you play are and explain. Global warming has already risen by 1.2 degrees, and this cannot be reversed in the foreseeable future, for to the contrary, it will continue to rise. And this is happening because all the destructive machinations are continuing due to the unstoppable increase in overpopulation, as a result of which, due to all the ever-increasing humanity in general, all their needs are also increasing, and everything is still being done to satisfy them. This also applies to meat production, which is created by huge herds of animals, especially cattle, which emit enormous amounts of methane gases that destroy the atmosphere and cause havoc. But also enormous masses of feathered cattle and all kinds of animals are kept for meat production, whereby these also cause excessive mischief, as for example also through diseases and epidemics. Consequently, all the efforts that will now be decided by the UN, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the scientific climate researchers and environmental protection organizations, and the Green parties etc. with regard to all kinds of climate protection efforts concerning the containment of CO2 emissions and other dirt, poison, and pollutant emissions into the atmosphere will also be of no use. The climate is already so damaged that the evils that have arisen will continue to progress and bring ever greater natural disasters that can no longer be countered by human power. As a result, everything will get worse and worse and nothing will change for the better. Not even if all explosion engines and thus cars and machines, etc., are taken out of circulation, as well as if fossil fuel combustion is banned. The enormous emissions that otherwise enter the atmosphere, especially from shipping, which uses heavy fuel oil for combustion, and also from aircraft, which emit enormous amounts of pollutants into the atmosphere, as do industrial smokestacks, etc., are enough to further increase the total destruction of the atmosphere and the environment. In addition, there is the destruction of nature and its fauna and flora on a very large scale through the application of tons of pesticides, fungicides and herbicides, which not only destroy large parts of the plant world and even destroy it to the point of extinction, but also birds, lizards, mammals, and all kinds of small animals and thousands of useful insects. And the fact that this also damages the health of human beings and that many of them increasingly succumb to the scourge of cancer and other dangerous diseases and die of them, is not cared for by all those who produce all the toxins, nor by all the others, such as farmers and horticulturalists, etc., who spread all these poisons in nature. And the fact that these toxins then also get into food and the atmosphere and water, and thus also into the bodies of human beings and animals, etc., and cause complaints and illnesses and even death in them, is of no concern to the unscrupulous people responsible, because they are all only interested in their horrendous profits. And the fact of the matter is that the origin and the resulting machinations and the effective effects of the whole thing are based solely on the fact of the overwhelming overpopulation, because its constant and unstoppable growth requires more and more of all substances, materials and achievements, as well as of medicine, food and luxury goods, etc. So more and more necessary things were and are needed, as well as furniture, houses, vehicles, ships, aeroplanes, and construction machinery, which in turn required new roads, tunnels, factories, corporations, etc., and much else for their production, and was driven up to ever higher heights by the continuing increase in overpopulation, and is being driven up further and even worse. And this is so because there is neither a governmental legal multi-year worldwide birth stop nor a worldwide controlled birth regulation, which alone in the long run could slowly bring all worldwide rampant evils under control and to dissolution. And this could happen in this framework only if, through the reduction of Earth humans as a result of a birth stop and birth control as well as natural deaths, all the machinations that have been rampant for a long time and that destroy nature, its fauna and flora, as well as the atmosphere and the climate, which were triggered by the mass overpopulation of humanity and have been operated up to now, but are also still being operated irresponsibly, were slowly reduced. But what wants to be done by the loudmouths of those climate researchers, environmentalists, green parties, and other environmentalists who only spit big words into the world and function with confused ideas, useless proposals, regulations, and irrelevant assertions, partly corresponds to some necessities, but not to what has to be done effectively. On the one hand, they are incapable of recognizing the effective truth that overpopulation, with its irresponsible and criminal machinations against nature, its fauna and flora, the atmosphere and the climate, is solely to blame for all the evils and catastrophes that exist worldwide. This, while on the other hand, they are probably too stupid or too cowardly to look for the real truth, or to accept it from those who effectively know the real facts and shout them out into the world. As I, for example, have done time and again since the 1940s through predictions and still do today. But this does not want to be recognized, or, out of sheer fear and cowardice of unpleasant reactions from uninformed layers of the population, it does not want to be brought up, as especially all public media do not publish such statements and warnings, do not mention them, do not explain them to Earth humans, and thus keep them quiet. But there are other facts to be mentioned which relate to the future, for as a result of overpopulation further evil, malicious, criminal and destructive machinations will arise from it, such as acts of terrorism, acts of war, persecutions, droughts, tremendous storms, famines, racial hatred and religious hatred, as well as diseases and epidemics which will be spread all over the world. There will also be new refugee flows in the coming times, which will again increase en masse and bring with them enormous problems, as well as criminality, crime, and family destruction. The already severely atrophied interpersonal relationships and the indifference of human beings towards each other and towards nature, its fauna and flora and also its destruction will increase more and more and in a more blatant way. All the evils in this respect and the catastrophes resulting from them are constantly accumulating more and are growing ever more tremendously in their strengths, But the great mass of Earth humans have still not understood that the constantly increasing, further degenerating and criminal machinations of overpopulation are to blame for this, which are being inexorably pushed on by the overpopulation growth. The current overpopulation of human beings on Earth has long since exceeded the ecological carrying capacity of their habitat, and this fact is the central problem of Earth humans, fueling ever more poverty, hunger, unemployment, and the growth of slums, which today occur mainly in developing countries and can be traced back to the population explosion there, and the resulting strong population pressure. But this is not enough, because further on, the degenerated machinations of overpopulation have also resulted in devastating environmental problems that destroy the world climate and destroy nature and its fauna and flora, and the globally destructive ecological footprint of humanity. And this is also the case with regard to the consumption of oil, natural gas and natural coal, whereby petroleum, which is refined into motor oils and fuels for explosion engines, is needed on the one hand for all kinds of working machines and for motor vehicles, such as cars and motorbikes, etc., many of which are only prestige vehicles and would not be needed by the users. On the other hand, many absolutely nonsensical fuel-powered vehicles are constantly and increasingly being manufactured for sporting pleasure and the like, with their CO2 emissions destroying nature, the climate, and flora, as well as endangering the health of human beings and making them ill. And if we point out the catastrophic destruction caused by overpopulation due to the immeasurable consumption of fertile land for endless housing, roads, sports grounds, amusement parks, and production sites of all kinds, etc., then there is no understanding among the thoughtless and irresponsible and inexorably growing overpopulation masses. The criminal machinations that are unthinkingly carried out by the overpopulation in order to keep it alive on the one hand, and on the other hand to promote its high-driving luxury mania and also its growth leading to catastrophe, takes place worldwide in the overfishing of the oceans and all other waters. But this is not enough, because also a tremendous worldwide deforestation and a very precarious water consumption as well as harmful and toxic emissions that destroy and pollute nature, its fauna and flora as well as the atmosphere, which have been fatally affecting many human beings, the fauna and flora and many life forms for many years, are connected to the growth of the world population. The loss of forests alone is caused, among other things, by poverty, namely by so-called land grabbing, which is carried out by international investors who have huge areas of forest cleared for plantations, but where, on the other hand, there is also strong population growth in the affected regions. The human beings in these areas are mostly farmers who practice subsistence farming, a form of farming that consists of a small economic unit, for example a farm, producing all the goods it needs for its own consumption and is therefore independent of the market. Due to the strong population growth, it was and is no longer possible for them to feed their families, because their available arable land is disappearing due to clearing, and the land is succumbing to soil erosion because the cleared forest no longer protects it, resulting in a much greater loss of arable land in the long term. Overall, however, forest loss also has a significant impact on the lives of populations in poor countries worldwide, because the forest no longer protects the soil from washouts, floods, and avalanches. In addition, in poor countries, the forest is often the most important source of heating and cooking material, because most cooking is done with wood. If we look at the availability of water or the available freshwater resources in relation to the amount of fresh water that a person needs per year, we can define water scarcity, water shortage, water emergency, and even water crisis, depending on the amount of water. The lack of water today is already one of the central problems in some parts of the earth, which will affect more and more human beings all over the world in the future, with the number of deaths caused by lack of water increasing rapidly and strongly, and will inevitably lead to armed conflicts over water. If, according to your Plejaren data and calculations, the current water availability for Earth humans is considered, then today, in 2018, only 65% of the world's population has sufficient water, while the rest of the world's population, namely 25%, is already suffering from water scarcity and even 10% already from dangerous water shortages. With regard to the uncontrolled increase in overpopulation, It is politically claimed with lies and deception that births are declining in various countries. But on the one hand, this is only a lie to calm people down. And on the other hand, it is the case that in reality, births are continuing to increase worldwide. Because year after year, more and more women are capable of giving birth. And of course, they also bring offspring into the world. Today, in 2018, the Earth is already so overpopulated that several Earths would be needed to distribute the mass of overpopulation and to populate the planets with a reasonable number of human beings so that they do not threaten to collapse one day. But this is exactly what is threatening the Earth in the future. For this will be the case if reason does not finally prevail with all Earth humans and a birth stop of several years is finally enforced, followed by strict officially controlled birth control. Until now in 2018, selfish irrationality still prevails among the absolute majority of Earth humans, as it always has. Even the Tehran Proclamation of the 13th of May 1968 was of no avail in reducing overpopulation, when the International Conference on Human Rights included a passage stating that every married couple should be granted the fundamental right to decide freely for themselves on the number of their children and the intervals between births. This proclamation was also reaffirmed in the action programs of the World Population Conferences in 1974 in Bucharest, 1984 in Mexico City, and 1994 in Cairo. But effectively, all this has been to no avail, because in reality the whole thing is not controlled. Because to this day, no decrees have been issued by the state on a legal regulation of births, but instead, everything remains the same, and consequently overpopulation continues to be driven up. In 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women made the right to family planning binding for the first time. However, whether it will ever be possible to slow down population growth in the poor developing countries and in the industrialized countries depends not only on political decisions, but on the world population itself. At the Cairo World Population Conference in 1994, the implementation of the relevant resolutions came into focus, whereby the core points of the related action program included a qualitative and quantitative improvement of reproductive health care, including family planning, as well as the empowerment or transfer of responsibility of women, or the strengthening of their legal, economic, and social position. Population policy is officially pursued in various countries with the aim of reducing the number of births. But this is effectively only official, because in reality the whole thing is handled in an extremely lame and meaningless way, or not at all, so that everything is nothing more than smoke and mirrors, which, however, enriches certain administrators and state directors. So the whole thing cannot work, especially not in poor countries, where in many cases there is sheer poverty, and therefore also no functioning health system. In developing countries in particular, women in rural areas are often not reached, even if education is given about the rampant overpopulation and the urgency of birth control. In many countries, especially where Catholic circles carry out their sectarian suggestive soul-catching and have the lying say, there is criminal dirty work and raging against any education and birth control, and thus the entire population is frightened away and made impossible to have access to contraceptive methods and contraceptives in the first place. In the case of the Philippines in particular, this has led to poorer women very often becoming unintentionally pregnant and bearing children they cannot support. In 1979, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women became binding for the first time with regard to the right to family planning. However, the extent to which this convention is effective is still written in the stars. If one observes and considers the entire world in which women are treated by the male world, in which their rights are inhumanly curtailed, in which countless women are beaten up, raped, paid less than their male equivalent work, enslaved and prostituted or even murdered, then there is effectively nothing to be found of the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. Everything continues in the same way as it has been for thousands of years, with contempt for women, degradation of women, and self-important, domineering, and exploitative behavior on the part of the male world. Whether it will be possible to slow down population growth in the industrialized countries as well as in the poorer developing countries through reason, Rationality and a sense of responsibility depends on the one hand on the individual human beings of the entire Earth humans, but on the other hand also on intentional political decisions, decrees, and ordinances. For this, the implementation of the resolutions of the Cairo World Population Conference of 1994 would be centrally necessary. But this corresponds to nothing more than a pious wish, because fundamentally everything in the background corresponds only to an immature idea and, moreover, to no seriousness. If this action program were really serious, then its core points would include a qualitative and quantitative improvement in reproductive health care with the associated decisive education with regard to birth control, including family planning, and, as I have already said, the empowerment of women. That is to say, the strengthening of their legal, family, economic, and social position. Unfortunately, at such conferences, as at many others, there is only a lot of empty and nonsensical talk, with action programs being adopted and agreements being made in the same way, and agreements, treaties, and conventions being signed, which in the end, however, are worth no more than the pages of paper when they are shredded and destroyed. As a rule, nothing happens to educate Earth humans about the urgent need for a worldwide birth stop. Consequently, there is also no worldwide education concerning the extremely urgent necessity of an official as well as personal birth control carried out by every woman, as a result of which overpopulation remains unnoticed despite the urgency of what is absolutely necessary, whereby the human beings in general also fall into more and more evils, calamities, poverty, lack of possessions, lack of money. Even lack of money and complete destitution become hardship and incapacity and cause sorrow, suffering, mental torture, torment, ordeal, and unhappiness. This gives rise not only to distress, destitution, neediness and general limitation, deprivation and barrenness, but also to crises, miseries, and many kinds of grievances in relation to Procrustean beds or schemes of unpleasant situations, into which many human beings are forced by violence and suffer more and more loss, as a result of which they fall into destitution and into further predicaments. Thus, on the one hand, the many kinds of misery in humanity increase faster than the population rises, but on the other hand, the prosperity level of the upper elites also increases on average, and this as a result of ever higher wages and profit sharing, which are at the expense of the common people. The proletariat or the simple social class who, as workers dependent on capitalism, do not possess their own means of production and are therefore completely dependent on the capitalist elite. In principle, it should be assumed that the ever faster growing population of the world generally requires greater economic efficiency and productivity, but this is exactly what is counteracted by the greed for money of the upper elites. Because in their pleonexia, or greed for profit and greed, they accumulate ever greater fortunes. Because instead of maintaining, expanding and increasing economic efficiency and its productivity, it is increasingly being reduced despite the growing need as a result of increasing overpopulation. And this reduction, which only serves the profit and wealth of the upper elites of every kind, makes the dependent employees unemployed, impoverishes them, and plunges them into misery. And one of the most important methods practiced by the upper elites, who greedily hoard and increase their wealth immeasurably, is to move their production plants to low-cost countries with or without official authorization, thereby putting their established workers out on the street and making them unemployed. Another way and method is to automate production processes in such a way that the workforces of the factories, companies and corporations are reduced by hundreds or thousands and made redundant and consequently made unemployed. However, where there are no production sites, but rather purely labor-providing enterprises, where only work is done, such as at the post office, banks, telephony, and all kinds of other similar enterprises and their branches, etc., the workplaces are abolished and closed without further ado in order to increase the wages and the wealth of the upper elites, whereby much is declared as service public, which is supposed to serve the welfare of the population, but which in reality is to its detriment, but mutually serves the horrendous profit and welfare and the accumulation of wealth of the upper elites. And in truth, the public service strictly cuts off all relief to the population, because by lifting and closing post offices and bank branches, etc., the population is forced to take much further distances under their feet or wheels to get to post offices and banks, etc. Consequently, a public service has come about that requires the population itself to do the work that the post office and the banks, etc., should basically do as a public service. But as far as the employees are concerned, they are simply thrown out on the street, and they do not know when and if they will get a job somewhere, and still be able to earn a living for themselves and their families with honest work, or whether they will remain unemployed, become a burden on the social welfare office, or ultimately sink into criminality. Over time, this will inevitably lead to widespread impoverishment in the working classes in all countries of the earth, which will inevitably lead to poverty, and thus to hunger, disease, epidemics, and the formation of slums, as well as to political and civil social unrest. And this will be particularly true in the future with regard to diseases and epidemics which, on the one hand, as a result of globalization, will spread to all corners of the world and spread multiple deaths, also in the industrialized countries, while, on the other hand, as a result of climate change, diseases and epidemics will continue to spread and appear in countries which, due to their cooler climate, have hitherto been spared from them. In particular, diseases and deadly epidemics from the southern hemispheres, such as Africa and South America in particular, will in future break through the borders of their southern areas of occurrence, invade the northern hemisphere, and bring deadly disaster to human beings. But diseases and epidemics from Asia will also spread throughout the world, because the climate barrier will collapse worldwide as a result of climate destruction. This will make widespread spreading possible, just as new species will emerge through mutations from old diseases and epidemics, as is also the case with the new variant of pneumonia, as you recently said privately, which has been building up in Asia for some time, especially in China, and which is being spread through the atmosphere. This, too, will increase impoverishment and social unrest, whereby the enormous mass increase in overpopulation will also contribute its share. For the fact that no long-term birth stop and no preventive limitation of the birth rate exists and is not enforced, it inevitably follows that there will also be no limitation of the exploitation of the Earth's resources, and that the Earth will be exploited, robbed, and destroyed to the point of collapse. Due to the growing mass of overpopulation, the standard of living of Earth humans will eventually deteriorate drastically, just as man-made diseases and epidemics will arise everywhere, spread and cause the human beings to die horrible deaths. The speed of chemical and technical progress will continue, and will also continue to bring much disaster, as has always been the case in this respect, because every new development in this respect has always been used for murder and manslaughter, war and terror since time immemorial. The digital network is also increasingly becoming a huge problem for humanity, because through its direct use, the Earth's population is becoming more and more socially impoverished and losing its ability to contact and connect with fellow human beings. As a result, the already existing interpersonal indifference is spreading more and more blatantly and no longer allows any compassion for one's neighbor to arise. But through the digital network and its direct use, human beings are also impoverished in terms of their education and the use of all their cognitive abilities, because nothing has to be thought about anymore. But for everything and all knowledge, only smartphones have to be clicked on, and application software in the area of certain operating systems, in order to find out in words and pictures what Tacheles is. As a result, there is no longer any need for laborious self-learning and study, because all desirable knowledge is stored in digital networks and can be retrieved at will at any time, without having to think about it, learn what is retrieved or otherwise cognitively process it, let alone store it in memory, as a result of which cognitive stultification is pre-programmed through the use of the digital network. Via the digital network, like-minded people can also be found, who can exchange their interests with each other, but who can also increasingly agree on and organize deviant, pedophilic, criminal, subversive, and terrorist machinations among themselves. Through the development of so-called biological weapons, dangerous bioterrorism is also developing, whereby, as Svath has already said, aggressive artificial superviruses are being released in this way to exterminate human beings and even entire peoples en masse. It is also to be said that due to climate change and the global warming that already exists and will also become unstoppable in the future, in some places the heat will reach lethal levels. All in all, the refugee crisis, natural disasters and Islamist terror carried out by the Islamist State, or Daesh, whose maniacal murderers believe in the apocalypse and want to establish an Islamist world order as the IS terrorist militia through fighting. Bloodshed, murder, manslaughter, torture, overthrow, atrocities, rape, and destruction are only a small part of what the future will bring. In terms of terror throughout the world, it is not the actual criminal terrorist organizations that are at the forefront, but the USA, which, in its delusion of hegemony and world domination, will, as it has always done, not miss a single U.S. terrorist act in order to satisfy its desire for world domination, however, will one day cost it badly. However, what has happened so far since the end of the last Third World War in terms of evil? Catastrophes and degenerations caused by human power and natural disasters, etc., was the beginning of all the horrors that are still to come. But there is also the EU dictatorship, which will disintegrate faster than anyone can dream, just as it will happen in the coming time that the nations will seal themselves off and ultimately new wars will break out between states that are still friends today if they continue to muddle along politically in the way they have always done and are doing today. If reason and rationality do not finally emerge, then the whole thing is inevitable, as it will also be if US America does not finally give up its world-greedy hegemony behavior and is not put in its place in time by all the states of Earth and a real global peace is not achieved in time. If all this does not happen, then bombs will again fall on Germany, and war servants from France, Greece, and other states will again invade Germany and fight, murder, rape, and plunder in the destroyed cities. And if this happens, then it will be that after all the refugees from Arabia who are now seeking shelter and protection in Germany, everything will change in such a way that from then on many Germans will flee as persecuted war refugees to the Arab countries and seek shelter and protection there, where, however, they will have great problems due to their lack of cultural adaptability. In large parts of Europe, the sky will then darken and the countryside will become devastated landscapes. All buildings and houses will be destroyed and plundered, just as there will then also be hardly any food to be found. And when this time comes, if Earth humans do not finally learn to follow the creational natural laws and recommendations in order to create worldwide peace on Earth in the foreseeable future, then it will be that merely meeting another human being will become a danger to life. And it will further come about, if man's mania is not stopped with regard to the new achievements to be created in the future, that research and development will be driven to undreamt of heights by cyberneticists, whereby biological, technical, and sociological systems will be used with regard to the most diverse kinds of research directions in order to develop self-acting regulation and control mechanisms. If, in the future, earthly humanity does not come to its senses, does not make a revolutionary change towards good and true humanity and towards serious, worldwide and lasting peace and becomes a true society of reason and rationality, then things will go badly for it. It is already the case today that businesses, companies and corporations dominate the lives of human beings and direct them as they please, without the workers being able to defend themselves against the upper dictatorial elites and get their rights. Even the trade unions, workers' rights and social benefits have already come under such pressure that workers who lose their jobs and are thrown out on the street due to the shoddy machinations of company and corporate administrations are left without rights and have to be glad that they are still tolerated as citizens by the authorities. Workers' rights are being trampled underfoot, and in the future the trade unions will lose their influence on the employer's world and be powerless. In the future, it may be that only by naming and using a valid credit card number or by paying in advance, medical transport and treatment, as well as police investigations, will only be carried out by paying in advance. The EU dictatorship and many other states around the world do not want democracy, while imbeciles from the Swiss population want to abolish the semi-democracy that exists in Switzerland and let themselves be enslaved by the EU dictatorship. In the future, however, there will be many other things about which the entire Earth humans will have to think deeply, for there will be extensive computerization, electronization, and their far-reaching networking, which will drive Earth humans to the edge of their existence if the cyber and cybernetics mania of the human beings is not stopped, which is bent on developing electronic machines with an artificial form of consciousness and an intelligentsia, so that ultimately supercomputers and electronic cyber beings will gain power over human beings. And if this actually happens, then the continued existence of the entire earthly population will be called into question, just as the continued existence of the planet itself will be endangered. If the artificial consciousness and the artificial intelligentsia come into being, then sooner or later they will become independent and powerful and take command of the internet with regard to all conceivable things. And then the whole networked infrastructure will be used against humanity itself, the ultimate goal being cyber hegemony and the complete annihilation of Earth humans. Repeating again and again, I must declare that the future will bring extremely dramatic events for earthly humanity, the planet, its nature and fauna and flora. For there will be ever more violent and devastating hurricanes and typhoons, as well as violent droughts, primeval storms and rainstorms with tremendous floods, destruction and deaths. And all these natural events are becoming more and more frequent and stronger, which as a consequence leads back to climate change, which is man-made, and whereby all the other evils, which are also caused by the responsible overpopulation machinations, are being pushed further and further, and which are altogether directed towards the destruction and annihilation of nature, its fauna and flora, and the planet. In the economy, in the financial world, and in the entire social system, there will be more and more crises, some of which can no longer be overcome. Global mobility will also increase to such an extent that no way can be found to cope with it, resulting in a devastating problem that will appear like a kind of epidemic of unmanageable proportions that will affect all countries. The longer, the more urgent it will become not to simply wait blindly against the great threats and let everything be decided by politics, which always plays on short-sightedness, because it has long since become necessary for every single human being on Earth to implement a long-term risk assessment, and from this to do and undertake everything themselves that is correct, best, good, and life-sustaining for human beings, nature, its fauna and flora, and planet Earth itself. The whole thing, if everything is looked at closely, is founded in a higher Gewalt, which as such arose from a complete human failure, from arrogance, megalomania, self-importance, recklessness, from irresponsibility and the delusion of being above all that is natural in creation, its nature and fauna and flora, and consequently of being able to play at creation itself. With this delusional thinking and behavior, however, the entire Earth humans have maneuvered themselves into bad luck and have already mismanaged and destroyed everything that is necessary for life in such a way that now only ever greater catastrophes are looming in the coming times. In all of this, it is not simply a matter of not taking any risks, but of consciously regulating everything in a correct and good way, by doing and carrying out everything necessary to find and tread good and correct paths, in spite of the looming hopelessness of what is to come, in order to make compromises that are acceptable to life with regard to responsible behavior towards nature, its fauna and flora, and the planet itself. In this respect, the human beings of the Earth must prepare themselves in principle, which is made clear by the predictions, for it will be extremely important for human beings to intensively cognitively agitate and do everything necessary that must be done in the future, and also for everything unpredicted, which must not yet be mentioned, for the protection of the human beings with regard to their intellect and reason. It has already become inevitable that social inequality will bring much misery and hardship, but this will continue to increase dramatically and drastically in the times to come. It is already the case that about 130 of the richest earthlings of the high elite have as much wealth as the entire world population combined has in its own assets. Finally, I just want to say that most human beings always know everything and also want to know and understand better. But in reality, they have neither true knowledge, and thus know nothing, nor do they know real reality and its truth. Consequently, They also have no understanding for all the catastrophes worldwide caused by the machinations of overpopulation, and thus man-made catastrophes, which is why the fact is that they do not even understand the future catastrophe, which they themselves carelessly and yet irresponsibly collaborate in and help to build. Namely the catastrophe, when it arrives, that no human being on Earth will survive, or only very few will survive.
What you are stating is actually more than you should say, because your effort in this regard is not likely to do much in the way of being listened to, as has been proven since you began warning Earth humans in the 1940s with predictions that have been coming true for some time and will continue to do so.
I know that, but still it is my duty to speak and to warn. And there is a great deal to be said about this, and also in relation to the dirty machinations of the USA and the EU dictatorship, which are trying by every infamous means imaginable to harm Russia, and to create out of it a malignant image of an enemy that is against peace and freedom. This, while the effective fact is that the West, that is to say the EU dictatorship, but especially the USA, are the forces preventing peace and freedom in the whole world, and are continuing the Cold War, which is still smoldering and has therefore not yet been overcome, namely because it is being maintained worldwide by the USA, as well as by the EU dictatorship as a vassal of the USA, and Earth humans are being misled. Through the image of the enemy, the entire world is to be drawn to the side of the USA through lies and slander. And Russia is to be branded the enemy of freedom and peace, whereby the West also uses the might of religions in many ways to achieve this. These would have to be abolished anyway, because they too only bring violence, discord, and lack of freedom and prevent human beings from thinking for themselves, as a result of which they are incapable, as they have always been, and will also be incapable today and tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, of recognizing the effective real truth and forming their own opinions, deciding for themselves and acting independently. This is also the reason why very many human beings are only puppets of those who control them and suggestively hammer into their heads what they should think, believe, represent as an opinion, and what they should do. Therefore, most human beings are so caught up in their incapacity that they cannot make anything of themselves, and therefore also have no real success in life. Consequently, they always see themselves as victims and therefore aggressively rebel against every effective real truth that is explained to them in relation to their wrong thinking and behavior. Therefore, everything steadily gets worse for them, because their wrong thoughts and feelings, which they build up in themselves through the religions that mislead them and live according to them, turn them into brainless believers without any initiative of their own regarding a free, peaceful, and open independent use of their own thoughts, feelings, and reflections in order to form their very own personal opinion. Unfortunately, this is not possible for a believing human being, because the fear of the impending punishment of God is always breathing down his neck, which necessarily prevents him from developing independent thoughts and feelings. So he cannot, out of fear of an imaginary, that is to say never existent and also neither present nor future existing, God recognized the effective real reality and its truth, that not an imaginary deity, but only he, the human being himself, is alone his very own Lord and Master over himself, his thoughts, feelings, opinions, decisions, and his experiencing as well as his responsibility and his actions.
What you say belongs in the ears of believers. But now, dear friend, I should discuss some things with you that must remain private in nature.
Of course, for I think I have probably said enough in monologue distribution for today.
So the following, then,